So I'm going to provide a perspective talking about multiplayer influence on research results, and I'll share a little bit of why that's here. Obviously, important for any presentation, and particularly important for this one, that I do have relationships with different parties. And so here are my disclosures, research as well as consulting, as well as editorial relationships. And I do have research relationships with the biopharmaceutical industry, as well as device companies and government agencies. Also should note in my role as director of the Duke Clunker Research Institute, we do a number of different projects, literally hundreds of projects that have funding from different sponsors, biopharma, medical and digital devices, government agencies and institutes, professional societies and advocacy groups. And then we also partner with different collaborators to conduct our research. And this may be relevant as we go forward in this discussion, and I'll point some examples of this. So and my first thing, I just want people to just consider like the broader question of who influences research results. And I'll just leave it here, like in terms of in your own mind, what do you think in this multi-answer question? So sponsors, funders, investigators, technologies, or all the above. And as we go forward, I know this workshop is going to be really focused on sponsors, and certainly they do influence research results, and other speakers will talk about particular cases of how that is, especially around industry sponsors. I'll note that as I'll share a few examples, it can be all the above. And so we have to be really aware of both the explicit bias as well as implicit bias and the behavioral economics that happens at both an individual as well as an organizational level for a variety of reasons. And then I want people to think about which funders may influence research results the most. Here's just an example of different categories: private life science industry, public life science industry, government agencies, contract research organizations, data aggregators, research technology companies, social networks, or any of the above. And I'll just say this is not an exhaustive list, but there are many different funders that may influence research results. And when I was vice dean for overseeing clinical research with particularly charge around research integrity, I saw some examples of each of these where this was at play. So I'm going to start with a case here. I am a cardiologist, and so I like to sometimes share like cases that may be helpful to illustrate what's the problem at hand. So this is 2011, a very large clinical trial is completed, first of its kind, actually the largest ever. Had a lot of hype and interest in the public arena, and was presented at a major meeting and ultimately published in the New England Journal of Medicine. The results were pretty neutral. Had a very mild benefit for the drug that was being tested. And so the sponsor had really low, or I'll just say completely cool to continue funding any additional analysis. There was a young faculty member who was a coordinating center PI. Other colleagues had noted like, well, like it's a modest effect in terms of trial, but it has such a unique data set. You should hold on to everything. That trial will make your career because you can develop so many different analyses and answer so many different questions because it was unique, and also could pave the way for future funding, and that there is multiple mechanisms. And so in some cases, this may not necessarily seem like a potential risk for a sponsor influence, because actually the sponsor here is completely checked out. Essentially saying, we have no longer interest in this area. However, there is actually a potential risk for future sponsor influence, perhaps, and that may come from different scenarios. And so I do often think about this, and that we often consider sponsor influences as what's the current ones, like how do you measure that? And the most easily way done is how much money is actually being provided, either to an individual or an institution. In this case, actually, going forward, the current influences, if you were to take that context, is actually zero, that there's no influence there because the sponsor is not there anymore. But there actually could be future influences, and that becomes a much more difficult situation to track, to predict, to anticipate. And it could be very large. Say, for instance, what if there was another company that may be interested in going into this area? And because you have a unique data set, actually may be highly interested in what could be developed for the future. And you may have some implicit bias in terms of, well, I want to have that future funding. I actually want to generate some answers that actually may align with that future funder. And it may not necessarily be just to the biopharma industry. It actually could be other funders, including government agencies. And that actually has happened. And I'll just say that this is an interesting concept that future conflicts actually may be some of the most interesting and challenging around. And just to close that case out, that young investigator was actually me. And I remember thinking about, wow, there are so many interested parties in this. How do I make sure that we're doing all the right things? And then later on, as I was overseeing clinical research at Duke, there are a lot of different issues in terms of research integrity that had come out in the years past. And so as we were taking our introspective review of how we as an organization can be better, there was a lot of effort in terms of what we should be doing for open science. And so this is an example of interesting issues that can come out. A book called Rigor Mortis, where it had a thesis essentially how sloppy science undermines tomorrow's medicine, and noted that over half of the studies can't be replicated for various issues, and that actually may impede medical progress. For in some cases unintentionally, but in some cases perhaps intentionally with implicit bias. And there are two examples that are highlighted that were funded either internally where a company aimed to replicate original research results with in-house experiments, or doing so with another approach. And interestingly enough, they both had difficulty in terms of replicating. So all this shows is that everyone can be at risk because of potential future influence. And there are certainly over the years, especially more recently, there's been this question about, what's the research reproducibility crisis? How has that been driven? And some of the themes that came out of that book, Rigor Mortis, highlighted that, well, funding levels have gone down from NIH. Where in the many years ago, the funding level could be as high as 30%, and now many institutes have funding levels about 10%. So there's fierce competition there. As the stakes in terms of healthcare or medical products come higher, there could also be higher future stakes for creating intellectual property, creating individual intellectual property that could be of value for others to industrialize. And that could be an influence. And there's also structural problems at times in hierarchies that prevent openness to research results. And then as science has progressed, the complexity in data provenance has certainly had an impact there. So there are other reasons here, but again, influence can come in many flavors. So case number two, a junior investigator develops a concept to improve functional capacity for patients with a cardiopulmonary disease. Has an idea that's pretty novel in terms of intervention targeting that mechanism of interest. As an experimental plan that goes through a series of different types of studies, smaller to larger, and the initial funding is academic. It's actually a startup agreement. And so there are these future plans for a K or equivalent to get an R01, and also ideas around intellectual property as well as industry. And so again, you can see that there may be some potential influence to generate, I'll call it, positive results and smart, quote unquote, designs. Now, so certainly in this case, maybe there is current funding and influence, and so there may be aligned interest with the academic progress or even institutional bias. And there's also certainly future influences. Again, just highlighting the future maybe have an impact here. And there is a behavioral economics concept called prospect theory that actually highlights, issues around either loss aversion or future winning that may influence people's decisions. Case number 3, I'll just here is showing a different concept, which is a novel trial that's being designed to be direct to participants and harvest electronic health records automatically. It's a very promising platform. Could solve many of the world's problems to enroll people easily and get their data seamlessly. There's a pilot phase to evaluate feasibility and to go to a fully decentralized model. And the funding is a nonprofit organization. The research technology companies providing in-kind support are highly discounted. And the research technology company certainly is aiming to have, I'll say, positive experience over the next year and has plans for a series of funding. And so when you think about the quality of data from this, how open is it? And is there any potential risks for a research tech company to influence the results? So where this has led us, or at least me and with colleagues thinking about this, is that the research ecosystem has many influencers and stakeholders. We try to provide a comprehensive kind of a view of this, noting that there are many potential gains that can happen from different points of view. And there are needs to try to address this in a much more public or open way so that we have trust and transparency. And so if you're part of any of these groups, you probably have been in a situation where there may be either direct or indirect influences or even potentially political concerns that come up. And there have been times where, unfortunately, the political environment can influence what people do. So finish up here where there are different organizations. NAM, of course, is one of those that continues to try to address these different issues. I'll share one example that was developed with the American Heart Association, American College of Cardiology, broadly trying to make sure that we're proactive as a community around professionalism and ethics. And I'll highlight one area that was particularly of interest to try to help address some of these issues. But the overall principles are shown here, and that there's not a single way to ensure that we manage conflicts of interest or relationships with different interested parties, and that there's an important cycle of things in terms of assessment of interest, management, oversight, as well as disclosure, and they're all tied together. One example that I want to share in terms of how to address this potential implicit bias is just making sure that there is awareness of associational or intellectual interests, that future gain actually may be important. And in some cases, I certainly have seen that intellectual interest or agenda really can drive different decisions in terms of study designs, reporting of results, and how they're doing so. Now, there are different ways to address this. I feel often that open science can do this. There's many different areas that have been trying to progress this to try to address influence, but we're not quite there yet. We still have, I'll just say, hidden data that could be unlocked not only for a gain, but also just to a gain of insights, but also just to make sure that there's established trust. So in summary, I'll just finish up here noting that influence on research programs and results can come from many directions, and that's something that's important to consider. While we often focus on explicit bias with direct funding, that may be easier to do, but there is implicit bias that we have to consider that may exist for future advancement of value, and that checks and balances are needed. We certainly see this in other areas in public health with regulatory agencies doing this for the public, but we also, as a community, have to consider how we promote open science, whether that's in academia, healthcare systems, or other players to help address this risk of bias, both explicit and implicit. So with that, I will stop here and turn it back over to you, Ross.
Okay, well, we probably have a second for one clarifying question. If anybody wants to put a clarifying question in the chat, we can catch it. But I would wonder, some of those are that you presented, Adrian, the complexity makes it really hard for the external party looking at the research to appreciate where those various influences lie. Do you have any clues or methodology that you recommend to expose where the biases may be entering into the research?
Yeah, I guess I certainly have endorsed like having more and more transparency to data, and so just by saying like even I use sometimes the example even if we're going to say like hey we're going to put the data in a shoebox so at least someone has access to it, just that potential for someone to lay eyes on it actually has a way to make sure that at least some of the implicit biases may go away. Now, certainly there are cases where people can be have malfeasance, et cetera, where like it doesn't matter. But certainly about transparency and data provenance is important. I think the other thing is it's important to make sure that people understand where there are other players who have influence in some way, whether that's in kind or other ways that can have future value for that party and ensure that's disclosed. So it's not necessarily just about the funder.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Adrian. You've got us launched.